I see some of our guests are knitting or crocheting. I love that. I'm really enjoying that. We've got some people who are still coming in, so I'm going to take a few minutes to continue to admit guests, and then we will introduce our speaker. So you might just finish that sock. This is the perfect thing to do on a Sunday afternoon. And I don't know about you all, but in Louisiana today, it's kind of a gray day. And for us, it's a little chilly. So this is a nice day to curl up and listen to a fun talk.
Well, I'm in the UK and it's 10 o'clock at night and dark and cold.
Wow, you get the Night Owl Award. Good for you. I'm so glad you're joining us.
I saw it advertised on Ravelry.
Lovely.
Posted it on Ravelry, so I thought 10 o'clock isn't too late, as long as it doesn't go on too long.
It won't go on too long. There will be questions, and if there are more than we can handle tonight, and you're up way past your bedtime, our speaker is available through that site, through Ravelry. So, all right, we've got lots and lots of folks coming in. Now, as I admit people, I'm going to do my best to mute everyone so that we can hear our speaker. And if I haven't muted you and you mute yourself, that's even more helpful. Although I love to hear the UK accent. Thank you. All right. I'm just going to wait one more minute, Catherine, if you are okay with that.
Sure.
We have quite a few folks coming in with knitting bags, I see. Okay.
They will find there's a moment when I mention that in my speech in the program.
Perfect. It's perfect.
Oh gosh, I just love to see everybody with their needlework.
I do too.
I see the Mona Lisa has a mask. I approve heartily.
And it's Ravelry.com, right?
Yes.
Yes. I put it in the chat box, but folks are asking about that already.
Woohoo.
Yes. Okay. Well, I'm going to continue to admit people as they arrive. And welcome to all of you. This happens to be our first virtual program from Louisiana's Old State Capitol. And because technically we work through elections, it's a little trickier because our elections are so secure. But so far, so good. I can see all of you. And I'm going to, as I said before, I'm going to try to mute you as I admit you into our talk. But if for some reason I don't, if you'll mute yourselves, it'll be much easier to hear our speaker. Have a group of people I've been meeting right now. I recognize some of these names as well. So welcome. We are a political history museum, and we feature exhibits and programs on a wide range of topics of political interest, as well as the glorious architecture and fascinating history of this national treasure that we call Louisiana's Old State Capitol. We invite you to visit us in person. You can come safely, or if you're far away, you can come to our website to see virtual exhibits that include interviews with artists currently on exhibit, and much more. I have put the links to our website and more information about Dr. Durack in our chat box at the beginning of the chat box. And I will save the contents of the chat box for those of you who need that later. Most of you know that this year marks the 100th year centennial mark since the passage of the 19th Amendment to the Constitution. That was the thing that had to happen to open up the right to vote for women across the entire country for the first time. Our curator, Lauren Davis, has created an exhibit based on Louisiana's story in the struggle for women's right to vote. That right to vote, the struggle for that is called Suffrage. And her exhibit is entitled Lion-Hearted Ladies, Championing the Right to Vote, which is going to stay on view until the end of next year. We're keeping that up a bit longer since we were closed due to the pandemic earlier this year. And another exhibit with the Contemporary Fiber Artists of Louisiana, a dynamic group of artists working in a broad range of fiber media, including thread, yarn, paper, and more, in astonishing ways, are featured in an exhibit that is also up called In Celebration of Women, which I also highly recommend. Again, if you can't come to see it in person, it is up until December 19th. It will also be up virtually on our website, which is posted in the chat box. You can visit the museum free of charge, and as I say, safely with your mask. It's a huge 10,000 square foot building. It's very easy to social distance here. And we're open Tuesdays through Saturdays. And our website is always open. I'm putting our website, as I said, in the chat box along with some more information for you. If you've got any questions, I'm also checking the chat box for questions, and I will answer those as we go or at the end of our talk. Let's go over some of the buttons on your screen just so you can sit back and continue to crochet and knit, or just get cozy in your chair on this winter day. You'll notice buttons at the bottom of your screen. By hovering your mouse downward, those buttons will come up. You should be all muted so that we can hear our speaker. So if you have comments or questions during the presentation, as I said, you're invited to put those in the chat box. Just click on that button on the lower part of your screen, and to the right, you'll see a part where you can type in your questions. Up in the upper left-hand corner, you should see a red dot that's blinking on and off. That means we're being recorded, and that recording will be available to you at some point afterward. I've had a few questions about that already, and once that's available, we'll send that out to all of you. Please feel free to toggle your view using buttons in the upper right-hand corner so that you can see our speaker and her presentation. I'll now introduce our speaker, and very soon you can shift your view to her study in Ohio, where she joins us this evening. Her name is Dr. Katherine Durack, and she's presenting a talk she calls Suffrage in Stitches, celebrating women's fight for political voice through crochet. Her research of the history and heroes of the women's suffrage movement found some unexpected connections between the art of crochet and the historical events of women's rights and suffrage. She sews and knits, but her go-to is crochet. In fact, Dr. Durack was inspired to create designs in crochet as a tribute to the suffrage movement, one of which I'm currently wearing. And I'm pleased to see so many of you have asked about this in the chat box. This scarf was created by Jeanette Bancroft, a big fan of the old state capitol, my former neighbor in Philadelphia, who's now living in Nevada. And this scarf made an appearance in an exhibit earlier this year called One Half the People. Though for those of you who don't crochet, Jeanette Bancroft can make your crochet dreams come true. And I've included information on how to reach her on our chat box as well. Dr. Durack has been interviewed by PBS NewsHour, and you can hear a recording of that. And what I loved is that she pointed out that needle arts has been an important means of political expression throughout American history. Katherine Durack is the author of nationally award-winning historical research. She founded Patterns for Success, LLC, where she pursues teaching, writing, and crochet design. Her Suffrage in Stitches project has been covered in Vogue Knitting and Yarn Market News, and her original designs and historical research have been published in Piecework magazine. Some of you may be familiar with those publications. She is the originator of The Genius of Liberty, a series of 6-minute suffrage stories about her home state of Ohio that I highly recommend no matter where you're from. She's a contributor to the National Votes for Women's Trail, on the National Board for the Turning Point Suffragist Memorial Association, a member of the 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Initiative Task Force, and has consulted with arts, education, and cultural organizations on suffrage history. In fact, she's so committed to her work that during this pandemic, she's supporting this cultural institution, Louisiana's Old State Capitol, by waiving her speaker fees, for which we are very, very grateful. I hope some of you may consider making a donation to Louisiana's Old State Capitol Friends so we can continue to have speakers either virtually or in person offered throughout the remainder of this year and next. Louisiana's Old State Capitol is so pleased to welcome Dr. Durack. Thank you so much, Dr. Durack. I'm going to now allow you to host our meeting so you can present your talk.
Perfect.
Yes. I can find you.
So once we get this done, then I'll bring up my slides.
Thank you. Alrighty. I'm just trying to find you in the flurry of people who are still coming to join us.
Yeah, the list. So you got to find me.
Indeed. And it's not alphabetical. So I'm assuming you're the first one here, no? Thank you. I've got a helper here.
My first name, it says, in my list, I'm above you.
Okay. Well, y'all, I did tell the early comers this is our first virtual presentation. And here we go. I found you. You're right in the middle for me. So what do you know? All right. I'm about to make you host.
All righty.
Thank you so much for your patience. I'm going to mute myself and sit back and enjoy.
Gosh, it's great to be here with everybody. Give me just a second, and I've got lots of pretty pictures to show you. And so, as everybody knows by now, this year is the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, which granted to women nationwide in the United States the right to vote. And what I'm going to talk to you a little bit about this evening is this project I began 5 years ago, Suffrage in Stitches. And I started it as a way to initiate conversations with other people about the suffragists and to help disseminate their stories. Now, Suffrage in Stitches draws on this historical association of females with needle arts. Now, many of us have obsolete, I use that term advisedly, obsolete textiles like these squirreled away in our closets, our attics, and our cedar chests. These particular items were made by women in my family. Now, as a technical writing historian, I became interested in how the language we used to write instructions for needlework evolved in pattern books like these in the 19th and early 20th century, when sewing, knitting, and crochet were considered essential education for young girls. And I was poking around in needlework books like this when I realized that the period during which modern knitting and crochet instructions evolved, roughly from 1840 to 1950, coincides with the US women's suffrage movement, which is typically dated from 1848 to 1920. And I was intrigued by the way these books, especially the very early ones, equated needlework with character. So I'm not able to advance my slide all of a sudden. There we go. All righty. So here's one example. This is the Ladies' Work Table book, and it asserted that knitting, crochet, and other forms of needlework were not only sources of personal gratification, but of high moral benefit and the means of developing and surpassing loveliness and grace, some of the highest and noblest feelings of the soul. So having read that, I did what I think any reasonable person would do. I Googled the word suffrage with the word crochet. It turns out that crochet served three different functions when it came to arguments about women and rights. Early in this time frame, crochet was used to ridicule women who sought equal rights and political participation. Along the way, crochet became associated with frivolous needlework, while knitting was appreciated as practical needlework. Finally, after the turn of the century, crochet was used to ridicule women who did not seek equal rights and political participation. So here are some examples. This cartoon, called The Parliamentary Female, is from an 1853 edition of Punch's Almanac. You can see the female member of parliament working hard at her desk while her husband tends the children. He comes into the room and he pleads with his wife. Couldn't they go to a play that evening? And she responds that she is just too busy because she has a committee meeting tomorrow morning and a speech on the great crochet question to prepare for the evening. Now, anyone who has ever tried to make something by decoding cryptic antique instructions can well imagine why the great crochet question might be a matter for debate. A few decades later, the new woman appears on the scene. Now, this photograph communicates the anxiety many felt about women's changing roles. Note how our new woman strikes a particularly unfeminine pose. She wears pants, she smokes cigarettes, and it appears, if you look in the background, she rides a bicycle, leaving her apron and the washing to her husband. So who was this new woman? This novel from 1898 suggests that the new woman might be the rebellious daughter of a model mother, an industrious German immigrant who is a splendid housewife, who could prepare a good meal, bake bread, knit and darn stockings, sew, wash, iron, milk cows to perfection, and handle horses. Note that the model mother mostly does practical needlework, knitting, and she rarely indulges in crochet. Now, when the rebellious daughter seeks independence and education, the novel dictates that by that road lies ruin. And our new woman is warned by her mother, do not disregard the rules of eternal order and right which heaven itself has ordained. When a group of new women testified before the US Senate in February 1894, they remarked upon how men had usurped the useful and essential activities of women during the Industrial Revolution, taking over tasks culturally assigned to women's sphere, and in the process, stripping women of social power. You bake our bread, you wash our clothes, you do our husbands' and our sons' tailoring, you do our knitting, spinning, and weaving. You even aspire to make our dresses and bonnets, Clara Colby testified. Connecting patriotism to productive labor, Colby urged senators to grant women voting rights. As all these industries of our grandmothers are now carried on largely by men, I ask that women have an opportunity to consecrate their new powers and possibilities for the good of their country, as conscientiously as did the foremothers of this republic. Crochet, by the way, is not listed among the useful industries of women, perhaps because crochet, unlike so many other fiber arts, cannot be mechanized. So perhaps that's why it was not considered useful. Anyway, a couple of decades later, Harper's Weekly featured this sketch of British suffragist Emmeline Pankhurst leaving the United States after her 1913 tour. The magazine also included an interesting piece of historical fiction about a Miss Stone Thrower, a militant suffragist who gives a speech at a women's club. Now, as the suffragist steps to the podium, expecting to rouse her audience to action with stirring words of daring and political intrigue, the club women sat and began to crochet. No matter what the frustrated speaker said or did, according to the story, the women crocheted on. So it is no surprise that some suffragists, like Inez Haynes Irwin, swore off any kind of needlework, vowing never to sew, embroider, or knit, because fancy needlework and the women who produced it were so trivialized. In 1929, this denigration of needle arts showed up in notes recorded by researcher Ann Rotter on a congressional voting card for Senator George H. Moses. Having introduced the Equal Rights Amendment 6 years earlier in 1923, National Women's Party members collected data on Congress members' attitudes towards the amendment. According to Rotter's notes, Moses, quote, thinks the ERA is a fool amendment and is dead against it. And he stated that he was through putting embroidery in the Constitution. Now, if early needlework books embroidered truths about elevating women by building character through knitting and crochet, the advent of ready-to-wear clothing coincided with backhanded criticisms that homemade items risked having the look of loving hands. At the same time, instructions published by thread manufacturers promised that crocheting lace was a respectable way for a woman to earn a livelihood. The reality for home needleworkers was strikingly different. Labor photographer Louis Hine documented the dire poverty of piece workers. This August 1912 photo shows children aged 9 to 13 crocheting to earn money for their family. Poor children like these worked from dawn to dusk for an interminable 68 to 72 hours per week. Appalled by these grim realities, suffragists like Florence Kelley did not restrict their activism to women's voting rights, but agitated for other progressive reforms, including the elimination of child labor, an 8-hour workday, the 40-hour work week, workers' compensation, and equality in funding for education that served all children, regardless of class or race. Now, it took millions of women, more than 4 generations, the right to to secure the right to vote nationwide in the United States. Women sold needlework to raise money. They lobbied politicians. They gave soapbox speeches on street corners. They gathered signatures on petitions. They held public pageants, and they marched in parades. Suffragists and the fight for women's voting rights have inspired most of my original crochet designs, as well as my personal knitting and sewing projects using designs created by other people. So Suffrage in Stitches started with a photo from this book, Ken Flory's Woman Suffrage Memorabilia. On page 52, Flory includes a photograph similar to this one of the Holloway brooch that is in his collection, a silver and enamel pin that depicts a portcullis, the symbol for the British Parliament, embellished with an arrow tip in green, white, and purple enamel. Designed by Sylvia Pankhurst, these pins were awarded to suffragists who had been arrested and jailed for the cause. And you can see here that Sylvia is wearing her pin in this photo, and she incorporated the broad arrow design that signified government property from the prison clothing worn by jailed suffragists, including her sister Christabel and their mother Emmeline. Now, Alice Paul, an American Quaker who had traveled to England for her graduate education, became involved in the British suffrage movement, for which she was arrested, imprisoned, and force-fed. Like British suffragists, Paul was awarded the Holloway brooch for her courage and for her sacrifice. Now, I did what I think any needleworker would do. I looked at that Holloway pin and I thought, wow, I bet I could do that in crochet. I mean, that's what you're all thinking, right? So here we have the very first project I did, the Holloway scarf, crocheted in a yarn called sterling. It has a little silver metallic thread that runs through it, and it's decorated with beads that echo the green, white, and purple enamel from the pin, the colors of the Women's Social and Political Union, signifying hope, purity, and dignity. Now, this particular book, it's a wonderful book of historic fiction, was inspired by real-life abolitionist and women's rights activist Sarah Moore Grimke, who received on her 11th birthday a slave, Hetty, a Black child who was charged with being her playmate and her personal servant. Based on a true story, Sarah and her sister Angelina were the first wealthy Southerners to leave their home to speak publicly against slavery. In 1837, the sisters were recruited by the American Anti-Slavery Society. Now, naturally, the first people they spoke to were women in sewing circles. Now, when later they began to draw large crowds, which were described at the time as promiscuous because they included both women and men, the sisters discovered that in order to argue against slavery, they first had to argue for a woman's right to speak in public. We grant that slavery is a political as well as a moral subject. Does this exonerate women from their duties as subjects of the government, as members of the great human family? Angelina said. We do not and cannot concede that because this is a political subject, women ought to fold their hands in idleness and close their eyes and ears to the horrible things that are practiced in our land. Sarah was just as direct. Men and women were created equal. They are both moral and accountable beings, and whatever is right for man to do is right for woman. On May 16, 1838, Angelina delivered her last public speech at the Anti-Slavery Convention of American Women in Philadelphia at Pennsylvania Hall, a brand new building financed by 2,000 individual subscribers and dedicated to virtue, liberty, and independence. Now, as the women met, angry crowds started to surround the building, and they grew larger and more agitated every day of the convention. By the time Angelina took the podium, the roar of the mob outside threatened to drown her out. She kept speaking, though, even as bricks and stones crashed against the building and shattered the windows. The women, black and white, eventually exited Pennsylvania Hall linked arm in arm for their mutual safety. The next night, the building was surrounded once again, and the mob set it alight, burning it to the ground. Now, the sisters advocated abolition and women's rights for the rest of their lives, even though they left public speaking. Working with Theodore Weld, Angelina's husband, the sisters compiled American Slavery as It Is from thousands of Southern newspaper clippings. This was the most influential and widely read book on the subject until Harriet Beecher Stowe published Uncle Tom's Cabin. So for Sarah and Angelina Grimke, I created two sister projects, Liberty and Justice. The design motif both projects used was inspired by a quote from Hetty in The Invention of Wings. I made a new quilt from scratch, red squares and black triangles, the blackbirds flying away. I used the gradient yarn on justice to communicate that if we do not protect these values, liberty and justice will fade from our democracy. Now, this most interesting book explains how the US women's movement splintered over rights and race after the Civil War. From 1866 to 1869, Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, and Lucy Stone were among the nationally prominent leaders of a new organization, the American Equal Rights Association. As constitutional amendments were proposed to grant new rights to freed slaves, the women sought universal suffrage, which would enfranchise both persons of color and women. Opponents of women's suffrage, including abolitionists, their former closest allies, argued that this was the Negro's hour and that the women must wait. Some suffragists were willing to campaign for the 15th Amendment, enfranchising freedmen alone, but others were not. As a result of the disagreement, the American Equal Rights Association split into two groups. The American Women's Suffrage Association, founded by Lucy Stone and Julia Ward Howe, among others, and then the National Women's Suffrage Association, led by Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton, which notoriously accepted funding from white supremacist George Francis Train. So for this moment, for Reconstruction, I created two projects, black and white and blue and gray. These are both Tunisian crochet, and I used identical stitch mechanics. So believe it or not, you're doing exactly the same thing with your needle and thread, your hook and thread, but yet you get two completely different looks. And my goal here was to reflect how, although suffragists were united in their ultimate goals, they were deeply divided about timing and tactics. Now, Lucy Stone was not the only activist with whom Anthony and Stanton fell out. Matilda Jocelyn Gage joined Susan B. Anthony and Elizabeth Cady Stanton in the initial partnership that documented the history of women's suffrage, a massive undertaking sometimes credited with founding women's history. This time, however, the disagreement was over religion, and the result was that Gage, though her name appears on the title page, was over time all but written out of suffrage history. Now, Gage deserves our attention for her work and the work she inspired. Writing in Woman, Church, and State, Gage advised citizens, do not allow the church or state to govern your thought or dictate your judgment. Read, examine for yourselves, and accept or reject from the proof offered. Another interesting part of Gage's story is that she had been adopted into the Mohawk or Iroquois nation, in which she could vote, and from which many early principles of early feminism were derived. Reflecting the contrast between civilized and savage nations in this 1914 cartoon shows Susan B. Anthony, Anna Howard Shaw, and Elizabeth Cady Stanton leading the suffragists as Native women watch. We whom you pity as drudges reached centuries ago the goal you are now nearing, the caption reads, explaining the ironic title. The panel at the side points out that Iroquois women had many rights white US women did not, including the right to own land, to participate in choosing their leaders, and to make treaties with other nations. And we have Matilda Jocelyn Gage to thank for the beloved story, The Wizard of Oz, as she encouraged her son-in-law, L. Frank Baum, to publish the stories he told his children, her grandchildren, of the feminist utopia Gage inspired. So I designed this shawl for Matilda Jocelyn Gage. You can't see it in the photograph, but there's a really beautiful emerald green metallic thread that runs through the yarn. It's a mohair. So the shawl kind of shimmers like the Emerald City. So I hope you could hear that. You probably are familiar with the tune, The Battle Hymn of the Republic, with lyrics written by Julia Ward Howe, whom I mentioned a little bit earlier. Now, this excellent biography, I learned from it that Howe was also a feminist pioneer who fought for her own independence from a repressive marriage to a feckless husband who squandered her personal fortune, used sex and the custody of her children to control her, and even excluded her from his will when he died. The battle hymn later became a suffrage anthem, though I don't know exactly when, and I can't tell you who wrote this suffrage version of the words. Now, Howe became involved in women's rights, no surprise given her history, and she actually served as the president of the first women's suffrage fundraising bazaar in 1870. Now, the success of this event inspired the 1900 National Suffrage Fair, which was coordinated by the National American Women's Suffrage Association and held in Madison Square Garden in New York City. Many of the details of the 1900 suffrage fair came from this woman, Rachel Foster Avery, the corresponding secretary for the National American Women's Suffrage Association. Now, charity bazaars were held and honestly continue to be held for all sorts of causes. And according to one scholar, the nucleus of the charity bazaar movement was the fancy work created by women for sale. While society admired charity bazaars for churches and other appropriate causes, suffragists were ridiculed for doing needlework to raise funds. The New York Sun declared that the suffragists of the country, the homewreckers, the unsexed, the women who have lost all feminine instincts are hard at work dressing dolls, fashioning baby clothes, embroidering doilies, painting calendars, and crocheting and knitting for a national fair to raise funds for suffrage. The newspaper also took a swipe at Alice Stone Blackwell, daughter of suffrage pioneer Lucy Stone. The best joke of all is that the editor of the oldest and largest suffrage paper in the country keeps a pile of washcloths beside her, and in the intervals between writing editorials, she crochets a fancy edge on them. For Blackwell and the 1900 National Suffrage Fair, I created two projects, Suffrage Fair washcloths and the Sunflower Suffrage Shawl. The sunflower was a symbol used by the National American Women's Suffrage Association in their logo, as you can see, along with a ribbon which has printed on it the words from the Declaration of Independence, that governments derived their just powers from the consent of the governed. So I began this program with an image much like this one of suffragists standing outside the White House holding signs. They were the first protesters ever to do so. These silent sentinels stood their ground in all kinds of weather, with or without umbrellas in the rain, standing on hot bricks during the bitter cold. They stood in silent protest despite the crush of hostile crowds that jeered at them, spat upon them, ripped the banners from their hands, assaulted them, and even tore the clothing from their bodies. When the police arrived, it was the suffragists who were arrested, beaten while in custody, and sentenced to prison for up to 6 months for standing in a sidewalk in silence, holding a sign. The prison shown in the background is one of several where suffragists were jailed. In fact, this prison had not been in use. It had been condemned, I think. I'm not sure. Anyway, it was not in use until the women were jailed there, and it was reinstituted. It's one of several prisons where the women went on hunger strikes and endured force feedings. Now, Lucy Burns, as you can see in the picture here, spent more time locked up in the than any other US suffragist. Kate Heffelfinger, you can see here, she's the woman with the blanket wrapped around her. She's shown after her release from prison, severely weakened, unable to walk without aid, weakened by force feedings and mistreatment. 2 projects honor the pickets and those who were arrested. A failure is impossible, and jailed for freedom fingerless gloves. So the Afghan was inspired by the banner you can see in that photograph. The banner quotes Susan B. Anthony's last public words, and it was on display at the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument in Washington, D.C. when I visited several years ago. The gloves were inspired by the Jailed for Freedom pin, the US version of the Holloway brooch. This one was Alice Paul's idea. And that brooch, like the Holloway pin, was given to honor the commitment and sacrifice of suffragists who had been arrested and imprisoned in the US. Now, once the 19th Amendment was passed by Congress, the National Woman's Party changed their messaging from pickets and protests to images like this one, dubbed the Betsy Ross of suffrage, linking activists with Betsy Ross's flag-stitching statement of feminine patriotism. Shown as Alice Paul with needle and thread, a star was added to the National Woman's Party flag every time a state ratified the 19th Amendment. So for that, I created ratification, a scarf with 3 stripes and 36 stars to commemorate the National Woman's Party flag. And you can see it, this is the right-hand photo where I have the scarf hanging from the balcony, is at what is now the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument in DC, the current headquarters of the National Woman's Party, different building from the one that's in the left. Now, the great majority of suffrage leaders like these you see in this photograph did not live to see victory. The campaign was won by their daughters and granddaughters for whom, as Anthony predicted, failure was impossible. Tonight, I invite you to commemorate the monumental achievements of the suffragists by joining me and becoming a 2nd century suffragist. So what do I mean by that? First and foremost, let's participate by getting informed, getting involved, and voting, as I hope many of you in the United States did in this last election. To my international guests this evening, I apologize for the US focus of these links that you see here. These are 4 nonpartisan sites that you might be interested in. Now, the League of Women Voters, you may or may not know, is a direct connection to our history of women's suffrage. It was founded by Carrie Chapman Catt, the last national leader of the National American Woman Suffrage Association. And the League was founded upon the disbanding of NAWSA, the National American Woman Suffrage Association, in Chicago in February 1920. So for more than 100 years, the League has been providing citizens with nonpartisan voter education. Now, VoteSmart is another source of nonpartisan voter information. And recently, I looked back at this site, and it looks to me like they're focusing a little bit more on younger voters. I love, if you're in the United States, I love causes.com, formerly called Countable. It's hard to keep track of what's going on in Congress. So through signing up through this site, you can actually follow legislation that's submitted to your members of Congress for their perusal. You can follow the bills, arguments pro and con, and you can actually see how your members of Congress have voted. So I think that's a real service. And then finally, we are still waiting for the Equal Rights Amendment. It has finally been ratified by the requisite number of states, but there's some problems because it was given an artificial deadline. So we'll see what, if anything, happens on that. You can follow the Equal Rights Amendment at the link at the bottom. Let's also celebrate by learning something. So I encourage you to read some of the books I've mentioned throughout this program. There are many more, although if you think about it, just think about it. How many books and films have been written about the US Civil War, which lasted, what, four years? And how many have been written about the suffragists and women's suffrage, which, depending on how you count it, took 72 to 100 years if you include the Civil Rights Act and the 1965 Voting Rights Act. So learn something. We've all got something to learn. Anyway, you can also follow these three initiatives: the 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Initiative, Turning Point Suffragist Memorial, and the National Votes for Women's Trail, along with the Pomeroy Marker Program. So the 2020 Women's Vote Centennial Initiative site includes things like quizzes, biographies, and resources for teachers. If you happen to notice that your state does not include a quiz, well, you know, this is crowdsourced. This would be a great time for you to do a little research and propose a quiz for the Centennial Initiative website. Turning Point Suffragist Memorial is actually being built at the site where many suffragists were imprisoned more than 100 years ago, at what is now Occoquan Regional Park. This is where Occoquan Prison was. Now, this was fully funded until the pandemic eliminated some pledges. Unfortunately, this has meant the memorial has had to be redesigned to cut costs, and it'll end up being built in phases as new sources of funding are identified. But you can follow news about the memorial on the Turning Point website. One of the really cool things that was announced fairly recently is that the National Park Service has made arrangements for some of the original fencing from the White House to be used in the memorial there. If you live in the United States and you'd like to do some socially distanced travel, the Votes for Women National Trail has many sites documented in a searchable map online. And select sites, some of you may have heard of this already, selected sites in every state will include special historic markers provided by the Pomeroy Foundation. This particular marker is from Versailles, Kentucky. I can't tell you how much I've enjoyed exploring suffrage history over the past 5 years as we've traveled for our vacations across the country. And I encourage you to do the same, especially when it's safe to do so. Now, this is me in Colorado Springs at a place called Garden of the Gods several years ago. And this is what that spot looked like in September 1923, when Alice Paul and the National Woman's Party celebrated the 75th anniversary of Seneca Falls and launched the Western Campaign for the Equal Rights Amendment. Finally, I invite you to make history by making your interest in women's suffrage personal. Explore suffrage history where you live, research the women in your family, and make and wear your own throwback hashtags. That's what I call these things that I've made. Clothing and accessories that invite retelling the stories of women's suffrage. And you can see, if you don't knit or crochet, there are fabulous pins and things that you can find online. Now, if your state is anything like Ohio, I expect that if you dig just a little bit, you'll discover fascinating characters and a good bit of nail-biting drama, possibly buried in old letters, photos, and your own family histories. Adoption of the 19th Amendment was the final successful step of lifetimes of effort for women's voting rights. And it's a complicated story filled with twists and turns because women's voting rights, like contemporary US election laws and procedures, varied widely from state to state, as you can see in this crazy quilt map. In fact, I was thinking, gosh, wouldn't I love to make that map a crazy quilt? At any rate, while Wyoming was the first to extend equal voting rights to US women in 1869, by the time this map was created in 1919, about a dozen states extended equal voting rights. And actually, roughly 3/4 of states granted women some form of suffrage. Now, my family is from Oklahoma, which you can see from the date on the map. This is where women gained equal voting rights by a state constitutional measure in 1918. And this, let me introduce you to Edith McCroskey Ziers. She was my funny and fiercely independent great aunt. And in the upper right, you see some of the things she crocheted. She just loved that multicolor crochet cotton. And then in the lower right photo, this is my Aunt Edith, how I remember her. In the front of her bungalow home, displaying the casket flag, honoring her grandfather's service in the Civil War, just like I remember her. My Aunt Edith was born in 1890, and with her parents and siblings, she moved from Nebraska to Oklahoma in a covered wagon. Years later, she divorced her husband when that was something that women just didn't do. And she lived most of her life on her own, perhaps because she was among those enfranchised in 1918. Aunt Edith, who lived to be 103, never missed an election. I invite you to join me and Aunt Edith, Sojourner Truth, and Alva Belmont. Knit a shawl or wear a filet crochet short sleeve sweater enhanced by knee-length flapper fringe. Crochet a vintage toque, a brimless hat suitable for suffragists barnstorming across the country by auto. Remember Abby Kelly Foster by knitting some socks with rust red soles. So this is one of the patterns that I've knitted by a different design. And then, of course, wrap yourself in the true story of how suffragists inspired Wonder Woman. Let's thank the 5 million women who used their voices to give us ours. Join me on Ravelry if you'd like to keep in touch. And thank you so very much. It's been a pleasure. And I'm going to turn controls here back to our host, and we'll have some questions, a little time for Q&A.
Thank you so much, Dr. Durack. I gotta say the comments coming in are really wonderful. And I know this sounds a little corny, but it's as if we were at a quilting bee, because the comments just kind of all together made a really lovely conversation during your talk. It was very nice.
Oh, I'm scrolling through them now.
Yeah, really wonderful. And I will copy those, the chat box comments and questions, as well as when I send the recording out to all of you, which will be available early next week. Yeah, it's really lovely. I loved especially the comments about how long people have been voting, and like the way you included in your talk, Katherine, of your ancestor, so fierce and so proud and so strong. Our curator included the voting card for her great-great-grandmother, which was available 1 month after the 19th Amendment passed. This beautiful engraved piece of paper, they still have it in the family as one of the most important family mementos, which is really lovely. So most of the questions are to ask about the links, what people can do now, and those questions came in before you started giving specific suggestions. I know when I was talking about your talk to some other folks, they were interested in why crochet in particular was different and kind of slighted more than the other needle arts. You addressed that somewhat, and I just wonder if you have more to say about that.
Well, crochet is, from the reading that I've done, crochet is a much earlier, much more recent innovation. And my understanding is if you compare knitting and crochet, and also it's my experience, I'm a critter, right? I crochet and I knit. So as a critter, you know, well, let's just start with socks. Crocheted socks are not going to ever be as comfortable as knitted socks. I just don't think it's really possible. But let me put it this way. I haven't found the crochet pattern for socks that would make a pair of socks as comfortable as those knitted. But also I think the crocheting is a product of the Industrial Revolution. It was very much associated with lace. Because it's very hungry in its use of yarn or thread. It requires economically requires that the raw material, the thread, be produced inexpensively. So, you know, I presume that it has to do with, again, that the fact that, I mean, how many, I have a dear friend who said to me, who we were walking and she was taking me to a summer farmer's market. And she was telling me about all the things that they offered. And she said something about the little old ladies with their really dopey crochet stuff. And there is still very much that strong association. And so, and tissue box holders was what she specifically mentioned. So as a joke for her, somebody with very fine taste, this friend, I made her a gorgeous hand crocheted tissue box cover, just to sort of make the point that you know, don't condemn the art just because of something somebody's made with it. I've been scrolling a little bit through the things here, and I see that somebody mentioned Terry Buscalia. I apologize for butchering your name. Mentioned Garden of the Gods. The photograph, and there are others. There's actually another photograph from the same setting showing they had Seneca Falls reenactors. So they had women in 19th century dress reenacting the Seneca Falls Convention at Garden of the Gods as well. Those are from Library of Congress. So that's where those photographs are found. I see somebody's very proud of Wyoming. You guys gotta really run through these comments, because we've got, some of you know a lot more. There's links to ERA. Oh, good. Somebody else has got a Pomeroy marker application in. Oh, fabulous. I'm scrolling. Do you have something else? I'm just sort of
Yeah, I'm really inspired by these comments. The fewer questions than just comments, if people want to chime in and claim their spot in this amazing story, which I love. I think it's wonderful.
I do see a comment here about Susan B. Anthony and the fact that her legacy is affected by taking money from the white supremacists, and why did they do it? So this is something I have not seen a lot of people reply to very directly. And in 1869, so in 1869, the male abolitionists basically turned their backs on the suffragists. The women, Susan B. Anthony, had for decades advocated for both causes. And there was actually a fund where that was for abolition and women's suffrage. And the women foolishly thought that for the Kansas campaign, they would have access to money from that fund because abolition had been achieved through the Civil War, and they would have access to that. And they were refused. That request was refused. And Wendell Phillips said this was the Negro's hour, and the women just needed to sit down, shut up, and step aside. And after decades fighting in partnership with these people for these two causes, I think Stanton and Anthony were really angry. So they made many of these comments, and they didn't have any money. So Train came with money, and they allied with him. Now, the US women's suffrage movement has been condemned for racism, and this has been, Anthony has been condemned for racism at this moment. I think it's worth pointing out that nobody is holding the male abolitionists to account for the sexism that resulted in Anthony's needing to take this step. The other thing is, once you switch from doing achieving suffrage state by state to a federal constitutional amendment, that is a numbers game. And even in 1920, after, I think 11 more states had joined the Union, all it would have taken to defeat women's suffrage in 1919, 1920 was for the former Confederate states to vote as a bloc. 13 states would have defeated would have meant that you couldn't have 36 of 48 states necessary to ratify the constitutional amendment. So, so it's an ugly part of politics. In order to achieve a federal constitutional amendment, they had to create this uneasy alliance for for women's suffrage. So outside of selling their handicrafts, their work at bazaars, did they use their handicrafts for suffrage in any way? Look at the banners, look at the dresses, look at the sashes. They're making these, the women are making these things. I've read comments about how, so in the anti-suffrage publications, the suffragists are criticized during World War I for not joining in and doing war knitting. And so the suffragists would bring their war knitting with them when they would sit in the halls of Congress or go to a meeting. I don't know about, that they made iconics, aside from the banners and sashes and that sort of thing. I don't know that they created iconic needle arts things, but certainly they demonstrated their patriotism through the needlework that they did during the war. How are we doing on time? Should I keep scrolling through here?
Yeah, we just had a couple more questions, and a note that it is interesting how civil rights for Black people and civil rights for women intersected, but not always to the benefit of one movement or the other, and in fact, tragically impeded those movements. In Louisiana, that did happen. There were women fighting for suffrage, but then decided to not support it if it meant extending the right to African American women. So it's a tricky history. And then I had someone who asked if there's a Facebook group that you are aware of for those who want to share history and crochet, or maybe that's on your site.
I don't. I'm a terrible social media person. I'm actually an introvert and shy and very happy under my rock. But I am on Ravelry. I would love to hear from other people who are interested in this kind of stuff. I'd love to see what you're doing and share with you some of the projects that I've been doing and encourage you to. Oh, I did want to share a couple of other things. So I'd love to give a shout out. Oh, crud, now I can't remember the yarn manufacturer, but this shawl that I've made here, it's in purple and a teal green, and it's not my design, it's another designer. You can look up the details on Ravelry for the yarn and the shawl, but the colorways, the colors of the two yarns, one is equal justice under law, and the other one is voting rights for women everywhere. And so you can work this into your project work just by simply choosing a colorway that some wonderful independent yarn dyer has done. And then this is, I was telling you about this one. So making use of the stars. I see people like the ratification. So this is a pattern I haven't published, but I have detailed notes for a hooded scarf. And I was telling you about this. So this is what the hood looks like.
Oh, wow.
And, you have the stripes here, and then the bottom has more stars on it. So this is just another fun thing that I've done, but you don't have to crochet. I'm also working on a descent collar. I don't know if others of you have seen that. And I was sharing with Caroline that Ruth Bader Ginsburg, I have really wondered if she got the idea of using the collars from a suffragist, an Ohio suffragist, whom she has cited in her own writings as a waypaper for many women's jurists. Oh, crud. Allen. I'm forgetting her name, but you contact me later and I'll tell you if you're really interested. Anyway, she's a judge, a waypaper in so many ways. First. She is shown with her judicial robes with a lace collar. The lace collars were just iconic for that period. I'm making masks out of suffrage fabric. This is a little hard to see. Here's another one. You can do it in a lot of ways. And what I hope people will do, that so much of this history is A, forgotten, B, unwritten. And the way that we recover and get women's history included is by sharing it. And it is really, yeah, well, Bernita Shelton Matthews, I see somebody said, she is one of it's Florence Ellenwood Allen. Thank you. So Bernita Shelton Matthews and Florence Ellenwood Allen both are two of three waypavers that I found. So where did I find the suffrage fabric? Spoon flower is an online, here, let me write it on. You'll have to search for the URL. It's expensive and it takes a while, and it's expensive, but realize what you're getting here is there's an independent designer who has created the design. They've done the artwork. Spoonflower prints it as orders come in, and then so sort of print on demand. So it's a little pricey, but I also like the fact that they are supporting individual, independent graphic designers.
And we've got to note that Benartex also makes a fabric line for Suffrage. I'm going to talk to our website person, and who's also our social media person, who's 30 years younger than I am. And any of you all who want to post your creations on our Facebook page, because our exhibits are being held up through the end of next year, because we don't want to just celebrate during this centennial year, but continue the celebration past this year and into next and beyond. Please don't hesitate to do so. We're on Facebook at Louisiana's Old State Capitol.org, and I'd love to see those, and we can share and maybe continue the conversation there as well. So many of you have got a lot of ideas and resources. Again, I will copy the chat when I send out the recording of this talk. And with that, I'll let you know what we can do to show your creations and share your ideas on social media and our Facebook page. I really appreciate it. Oh, and I see somebody's made washcloths too. That's wonderful.
Here, I'm writing an answer to that. Pattern was let's see I realize I need to do that for everyone. Give me just a moment.
Sure. I'm glad that you all are pointing out that this really is a unique and interesting way to look at suffrage, and yet it sounds like we're all on the same wavelengths too. And the fact that you pointed out, Katherine, that there's many books on other subjects, but very little on this, and it took decades from when the idea of the 19th Amendment, Susan B. Anthony Amendment, was first announced until it finally got passed. The ERA, Equal Rights Amendment, was written just after the 19th Amendment passed. So that's 1920. And we're still waiting on the outcome of that, one way or the other. So next year at the Old State Capitol, we'll have people who argued for and against it for a panel discussion. This is all pandemic, if the pandemic allows us to do this here at the Capitol, or we may do something like that online. Wow, we asked the right people to join you tonight, Katherine. This is really great.
It's just been a pleasure. My favorite people, fiber people are the best, right?
Thanks.
We understand patience and persistence.
And failure is not an option. I want to thank all of you. I hope we got to all of your questions. Feel free to jot me a little chat. If I haven't, go ahead and say you missed me. I think we got them. You know how to reach Katherine at that website. And if you didn't pick that up, I'll be sending that out to you in the next couple days. Katherine, thank you very, very much. Ladies and gentlemen, I hope you got a lot of progress done on your projects too, because I saw quite a few of you knitting and crocheting and working. Oh, and I do want to point out, this is the second message, about a suffrage portrait embroidery project, which just sounds really, really fascinating. I'm going to look that up after the talk. And Patricia, yes, Patricia, I hope you'll consider posting something on our Facebook page. I think we might just be continuing that conversation via social media here at the Old State Capitol. Thank you all so much. And Dr. Durack, thanks again for your patience and helping to see this project through our first virtual program. I really appreciate your work and your dedication to this. And those of you from Louisiana, I'm sending Dr. Durack a box of freshly picked satsumas, which are way better tasting than oranges. And hopefully she'll be able to come and visit us here in Louisiana next winter, because our winters are not quite as rough as yours up there. But I know you'll come with a crocheted scarf similar to mine.
Probably.
Thank you all so much for joining us. I really appreciate it. Thank you, Katherine. Take care.
Great to be with you all. Have a great evening now.
Stay safe. See you all on our website or at the building. Take care. Thanks.